The Wyoming wind didn't just howl. It screamed, tearing through the thin wooden walls of the Preston cabin like a starving predator smelling blood. 22-year-old Abigail held her feverish 4-year-old brother to her chest, watching her last piece of firewood turn to a brittle, gray ash. She had nothing left. No money, no remaining pride, no physical strength. Just 3 orphaned siblings, and the crippling, terrifying certainty that they would not survive the coming winter. Then came the heavy, deliberate knock on the door. It wasn't the ruthless banker coming to evict them. It was a man cloaked in bare fur and winter frost, standing massive in the doorway, who looked at her desperate tears and spoke the words that would alter their destinies forever. "Let me help raise them with you." The dirt floor of the cabin was perpetually cold, a creeping chill that seeped through the soles of Abigail Preston's worn leather boots and settled deep into her bones. It had been exactly 7 months since the cholera swept through the Bitter Creek Valley, taking her mother first, and her father 3 agonizing days later. In the span of a single week, Abigail had been transformed from a hopeful young woman with dreams of moving east to a weary, hardened mother to 3 siblings she was entirely unequipped to raise. Her hands, once soft and adept at embroidery, were now calloused, cracked, and permanently stained with the harsh lye soap she used to scrub other people's laundry just to buy flour. At 22, the light had vanished from her hazel eyes, replaced by a hollow, haunted exhaustion that aged her 10 years. "Abby," he's coughing again. Abigail blinked, pulling herself from the daze of stirring a meager pot of cornmeal mush. She turned to see 9-year-old Sarah standing in the doorway of the small bedroom. The little girl's dress was practically hanging off her thin frame, her eyes wide with a quiet, persistent terror that hadn't left since the day they buried their parents. "I know, sweetie," Abigail murmured, her voice raspy. She set the wooden spoon down and wiped her hands on her apron. She moved into the bedroom where little Toby lay tangled in threadbare blankets. The 4-year-old was flushed, his small chest rattling with every drawn breath. The damp cold of the Wyoming autumn was already settling in the valley, and Toby's lungs, weakened by a previous bout of whooping cough, were failing him. Abigail pressed the back of her hand against his forehead. He was burning up. Panic, sharp and familiar, clawed at her throat. She needed medicine. She needed to pay the doctor in town, but her coin jar was empty, save for 3 dull pennies. To make matters worse, she heard the heavy, angry thud of an axe out in the yard. She walked to the window and pushed back the tattered curtain. 14-year-old Caleb was savagely hacking at a stubborn pine stump. He wasn't chopping wood. He was punishing it. Since their father died, Caleb had become a tightly coiled spring of rage. He resented their poverty. He resented the pitying looks from the townsfolk. And most of all, he resented Abigail's desperate attempts to parent him. Suddenly, the axe glanced off the knotted wood, narrowly missing the boy's shin. He dropped the tool with a loud clatter and kicked the stump, shouting a string of curses into the biting wind. Abigail closed her eyes, leaning her forehead against the freezing glass pane. "I can't do this," she thought, the whisper echoing in the hollow chambers of her mind. "I am failing them. Pa, I am so sorry, but I am failing." Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. 2 riders trotted into the muddy yard. Abigail's stomach plummeted. It was Josiah Higgins, the wealthiest land speculator in Bitter Creek, accompanied by one of his hired hands, a brute named Cole. Higgins was a man whose tailored wool suits never seemed to catch the prairie dust, a man who smiled with his teeth but never his eyes. Abigail quickly wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped out onto the porch, standing protectively between the riders and Caleb, who was glaring daggers at the intruders. "Miss Preston," Higgins drawled, tipping his bowler hat. "A frosty morning to you. I see the place is falling into disrepair quicker than I anticipated." "State your business, Mr. Higgins," Abigail said, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to sound stern. "I told you last week, the farm is not for sale." Higgins sighed, adjusting his leather riding gloves. "Abigail, be reasonable. Your taxes are in arrears. The bank is losing patience. You're a young woman playing a man's game, trying to scratch a living out of this rock with 3 brats holding you down. I'm offering you a clean break. Enough cash to buy wagon tickets to St. Louis. Stay here, and you'll lose the land to the bank by December, and the county will put those children in an orphanage." The word orphanage struck Abigail like a physical blow. Caleb bristled, taking a step forward. "You ain't taking our land, Higgins. My pa cleared these acres." "Quiet, Caleb," Abigail snapped, though her heart bled for her brother's pride. She looked up at the wealthy man. "I will have the tax money by the end of the month. You just tell the bank to wait." "The end of the month?" Higgins chuckled, a dry, cruel sound. "You're taking in laundry and mending torn trousers for pennies. You owe $40, Abigail. If you don't have it by the first frost, the sheriff will be coming with an eviction notice. Not me. Think of the children, my dear. Pride won't keep them warm." With a condescending tip of his hat, Higgins turned his horse and rode off, Cole following close behind with a menacing sneer. Abigail stood frozen on the porch, the harsh wind biting through her thin shawl. $40. It might as well have been 4,000. When she finally turned back to the cabin, Caleb was gone, having vanished into the woods to escape his own helplessness. Abigail sank to her knees right there in the frozen mud of the yard. The crushing weight of her reality finally broke her. She buried her face in her dirt-stained hands and wept, deep, racking sobs of total surrender, unaware that she was being watched from the tree line above. High on the rocky ridge overlooking the Preston homestead, Silas Montgomery sat motionless upon his massive draft horse, Goliath. To anyone else, Silas would have looked like a wild beast himself, a massive, broad-shouldered man draped in heavy elk hide and wolf fur, a thick, dark beard obscuring the lower half of his face, a jagged, silver scar slashed across his left cheekbone, a lingering souvenir from a Confederate bayonet at Gettysburg. For 10 years, Silas had lived a solitary existence deep in the Wind River Range. He was a mountain man by choice, having retreated from the bloody madness of the world of men after the war. He trapped, he hunted, and he survived. He came down to Bitter Creek only twice a year to trade pelts for coffee, salt, and ammunition. He preferred the honest brutality of the wilderness to the deceit of civilization. Yet, for the past 3 weeks, he found his horse wandering toward the ridge above the Preston farm. Silas had first seen Abigail in town, struggling to load a heavy sack of flour onto a broken handcart while a group of men stood by, smoking and watching her struggle. He had seen the fierce, terrifying love in her eyes when she shielded her little sister from a passing drunken miner. Silas knew what sheer survival looked like. He recognized the look of a soldier fighting a losing battle, holding the line until the bitter end. From his vantage point, he watched the exchange with Higgins. Though he was too far to hear the words, he could read the body language. He knew Josiah Higgins. The man was a vulture, feeding off the misfortunes of the homesteaders. Silas felt a dangerous, dormant anger stirring in his chest. But it was what happened after Higgins left that truly struck him. He watched the girl Abigail collapse into the mud, her shoulders shaking violently. It wasn't the crying of a weak woman. It was the breaking of a pillar that had held up the roof for too long. Silas felt a strange tightness in his throat. He nudged Goliath, intending to ride down, but stopped himself. What could he offer? He was a scarred hermit, a ghost of the mountains. He had no place interfering in the lives of a desperate family. 2 days later, the situation escalated. Silas was checking a snare line closer to the valley floor when he heard a sharp cry followed by a scuffle. He moved silently through the dense pine thicket, his Henry rifle instinctively grasped in his large, scarred hands. He emerged near the edge of the Preston property, near the creek. Young Caleb was pinned to the ground by 2 men. Silas recognized them instantly, drifters. The kind Higgins often paid to intimidate stubborn landowners into leaving. One of them, A rat-faced man with a missing front tooth was holding Caleb's arm behind his back.
This story was posted
laughing
on the channel
cruelly
The
as
Rusty
the boy
Saddle.
struggled and
Please do
spat.
not repost
The
it
other
in
was
any
kicking
form.
the family's only 2 milk goats toward the road, aiming to steal their sole source of milk. Abigail came running from the cabin, wielding a heavy iron skillet, screaming at the men to let her brother go. She swung wildly, but the rat-faced man backhanded her across the face. Abigail hit the dirt hard, a cut opening on her cheek. Something inside. Silas snapped. The detachment he had practiced for a decade evaporated in a heartbeat. He stepped out of the tree line. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He simply racked the lever of his Henry rifle. The loud, metallic clack-clack echoed like a cannon shot in the crisp air. The 2 drifters froze, turning to see the giant of a man emerging from the shadows of the pines. Silas's eyes were cold, dead pools of dark water. He raised the rifle, aiming it squarely at the chest of the man holding Caleb. "Let the boy up," Silas said. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble, unused to much conversation, but carrying an authority that brooked no argument. The man scrambled backward, releasing Caleb. "Hey now, mister. We're just having a bit of fun." Boy was trespassing on Higgins's water rights. "He's on his own land," Silas replied, taking a slow, heavy step forward. "You're leaving." Without the goats, the second drifter dropped his lead rope, his hands raised. They took one look at the mountain man's hardened stare and the steady barrel of the rifle, and decided their meager pay wasn't worth dying for. They mounted their horses and bolted toward town without looking back. Silas lowered the rifle. Caleb scrambled to his feet, panting, his face bruised, staring at Silas with a mixture of awe and defensive anger. Abigail sat up slowly, pressing a trembling hand to her bleeding cheek. Silas walked over to her, his massive frame blocking out the afternoon sun. He reached into his coat and pulled out a clean, albeit rough, linen handkerchief. He offered it to her without a word. Abigail looked up at him, her chest heaving. She saw the terrifying scar, the wild beard, the sheer size of him, but as she looked into his eyes, she didn't see the cruelty she had come to expect from the men in the valley. She saw a profound, ancient sadness and a quiet respect. "Thank you," she whispered, taking the cloth and pressing it to her cheek. "You didn't have to do that." "They'll be back," Silas said plainly, his voice low. He looked at Caleb, who was glaring at the ground, deeply ashamed of his own weakness. "Boy needs to learn how to fight dirty if he's going to protect this place." "I don't need your help," Caleb spat, wiping a bloody nose. "I had him." "Caleb, stop it," Abigail scolded, though her voice lacked its usual strength. She looked back at Silas. "Who are you?" "Silas Montgomery." He tipped his head slightly. He looked past her, toward the dilapidated cabin, noting the missing chinking in the logs, the lack of a proper woodpile, and the quiet face of little Sarah, peering terrified from the window. "Winter's coming early, Miss Preston. You ain't ready." "We'll manage," Abigail said, her chin jutting out in a display of stubborn pride that Silas couldn't help but admire. Silas didn't argue. He just nodded once, turned on his heel, and walked back into the dense timber, disappearing as silently as he had arrived, leaving Abigail holding his handkerchief, feeling a strange, unsettling sense of safety for the first time in months. The first blizzard didn't arrive in December. It struck in the second week of November, screaming down from the mountain peaks like a white demon. The temperature plummeted 40 degrees in a matter of hours. Inside the cabin, the situation had gone from desperate to catastrophic. Toby's breathing had become a wet, terrifying wheeze. The firewood, which Caleb had struggled to gather, was wet and burning poorly, filling the small room with acrid smoke. Abigail had wrapped Toby in every blanket they owned, plus her own winter coat, but the little boy was shivering violently, his lips tinged with blue. Abigail paced the floor, her mind fracturing under the pressure. The $40 was due in 3 days. Higgins had sent a letter reminding her of the impending eviction. She had managed to scrape together $11. It was over. The cold was going to take her brother, and the bank was going to take her home. As the wind violently rattled the heavy wooden shutters, a rhythmic thumping sounded at the door. Not the frantic knocking of an enemy, but a heavy, deliberate pounding. Caleb grabbed the iron poker from the fireplace, standing protective but trembling. Abigail pulled open the door, bracing herself against the blinding rush of snow. Silas stood on the porch. He was coated in white, looking like a snow spirit. Over his massive shoulder, he carried a fully field-dressed deer carcass, and under his other arm, a large canvas sack clinking with supplies. Without asking permission, he stepped inside, using his boot to kick the door shut against the storm. The immediate presence of the man seemed to suck the oxygen from the tiny room, yet strangely, it also anchored the swirling panic that had been suffocating Abigail. "Put that poker down, son," Silas said mildly to Caleb, dropping the deer onto the small kitchen table with a heavy thud. He set the canvas sack on the floor. Meat, fresh, got potatoes, onions, and willow bark in the sack. Abigail stared at the fortune of food on her table. "Mr. Montgomery, I can't pay you for this. I have no money." Silas didn't look at her. He immediately walked over to the hearth, kneeling before the pitiful, smoky fire. With massive, capable hands, he rearranged the logs, pulled some dry kindling from his own deep pockets, and within 2 minutes, a roaring, hot fire was blazing, pushing the smoke up the chimney and radiating genuine heat into the freezing room. He stood up, finally turning his attention to the bed where Toby lay. He walked over, ignoring Abigail's tense posture. He pulled a small leather pouch from his belt, taking out a pinch of dried herbs. "Boil water," he commanded gently. "Steep this. Make him drink it. It'll break the fever and open his lungs. It's osha root." Abigail, too desperate to argue, scrambled to grab a tin cup and the kettle. For the next hour, a strange domesticity took over the cabin. Silas expertly butchered the deer, handing Caleb a knife and silently instructing the boy on how to trim the fat and cut steaks. Caleb, initially hostile, found himself captivated by the mountain man's quiet expertise, eager to prove himself useful. Sarah emerged from her hiding spot, watching Silas with wide, curious eyes. When he offered her a piece of dried apple from his pocket, she took it shyly, a tiny smile gracing her face for the first time in weeks. Later, as the storm raged outside, Toby's breathing finally eased, the herbal tea working its rough magic. The boy fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. The cabin smelled of roasting venison and burning pine. Abigail sat across from Silas at the small table, nursing a cup of hot water. The exhaustion in her bones felt heavier now that she had stopped moving. She looked at the man who had just saved her brother's life and fed her family. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice a fragile whisper. "We are nothing to you. You don't owe us this kindness." Silas stared at his calloused hands resting on the table. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the howling wind. "I spent 10 years up there," Silas finally spoke, his voice rough, scraping against the quiet of the room. "Told myself I was done with folks. Done with the killing, the dying, the taking. But a man watches you down here, watches you breaking your back for these kids." He looked up, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "It ain't right. A woman shouldn't have to carry the whole damn world on her shoulders." "I have no choice," Abigail said, a defensive edge creeping into her tone. "I will not let them go to an orphanage, and I won't let Higgins take my father's land. I'll fight until I'm dead." "I know you will," Silas said softly. "But you're losing, Abigail. You can't chop enough wood, make enough money, and fight off Higgins's dogs all by yourself." "Then what am I supposed to do?" she demanded, tears of sheer frustration spilling over her eyelashes. "Tell me what I am supposed to do." Silas took a deep breath, his broad chest expanded, and he looked around the tiny, fragile cabin, looking at Caleb sharpening the knife, Sarah sleeping near the hearth, and Toby breathing easily in the bed. "You let me stay," Silas said. The words hung in the air, heavy and shocking.
This story was posted
Abigail
on the
froze.
channel The Rusty Saddle.
"Excuse me?
Please do not
I can't
repost
winter
it
up
in
on
any
the
form.
ridge this year. The signs are bad. It's going to be a killer freeze," Silas explained, his tone entirely pragmatic, though a muscle in his jaw twitched. "I need a roof lower in the valley. You need wood chopped, meat on the table, and a man standing on the porch with a rifle when Josiah Higgins comes calling. You want to live here?" Abigail's heart hammered against her ribs. She was a single, unmarried woman. The scandal alone would destroy her reputation in town, though her reputation was hardly keeping her fed. "Mr. Montgomery, that is highly improper. Furthermore, I don't know you. You could be. I ain't a threat to you, Miss Preston," Silas interrupted, his voice firm but deeply respectful. "I'll sleep in the barn. I'll rebuild the stalls, insulate the walls. I'll work the land, trap the valley, and pay your taxes." "And what do you get out of this?" Abigail asked, suspicious. Men like Higgins had taught her that nothing came without a steep, hidden price. Silas looked at her. He saw the fierce, beautiful exhaustion in her face. He saw the family she was bleeding herself dry to protect. He remembered the empty, silent cave he called home, and the decades of loneliness that had slowly been turning his heart to stone. "I get to remember what it's like to be human," Silas said quietly. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "You are exhausted from caring for them, Abigail. Let me help raise them with you." The words struck her like a physical force. Let me help. Nobody had offered to help. Everyone had only offered pity or demands. Abigail stared at the scarred, massive mountain man. It was madness. It was a terrible risk. But as the wind screamed outside, trying to tear the roof off her home, Abigail looked at the fresh meat on the table, the roaring fire in the hearth, and her baby brother sleeping soundly. She swallowed hard, wiping her tears away with the back of her hand. She sat up straighter, gathering the last shreds of her dignity. "The barn roof leaks," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "And I don't tolerate cursing around the children." A ghost of a smile touched the corners of Silas's mouth beneath his heavy beard. "I'll patch the roof tomorrow, and I'll watch my tongue." The bargain was struck in the heart of the snowstorm, a desperate pact between a broken woman and a lost mountain man, neither realizing that the true storm, the fury of Josiah Higgins, and the complicated, terrifying awakening of their own hearts, was only just beginning. By the time December wrapped the Bitter Creek Valley in 3 feet of suffocating white snow, the Preston farm had undergone a quiet resurrection. Silas Montgomery was a man of agonizingly few words, but his actions spoke with the roar of an avalanche. True to his word, he had taken up residence in the drafty barn. Within 3 days, he had reinforced the main beam, packed the walls with a mixture of mud and dried pine needles for insulation, and built a small iron stove in the corner. He did not sleep in the cabin, preserving Abigail's fragile reputation, though the gossips in town, led by the perpetually bitter mercantile owner, Mrs. Agatha Gable, were already whispering venom. Abigail found herself waking up not to the bone-chilling dread of a freezing room, but to the rhythmic thud of an axe-splitting oak and the smell of fresh coffee brewing on the hearth. Silas would come in at dawn, quietly build the fire, leave a bucket of fresh water, and disappear back into the snow to check his trap lines before the children even stirred. The most profound change, however, was not the warmth of the cabin or the heavy sacks of cornmeal and dried beans Silas had hauled back from town. It was Caleb. For months, the 14-year-old had been a feral, angry creature, drowning in the impossible boots of his dead father. Silas didn't coddle the boy. He simply put him to work. He taught Caleb how to read the tracks of a snowshoe hare, how to properly oil the action of a Winchester rifle so the cold wouldn't freeze the firing pin, and how to swing an axe using the weight of the heavy iron head rather than his own exhausting muscle. One bitterly cold Tuesday, Abigail stood at the frosted window, watching them. Silas was showing Caleb how to skin a silver fox. The giant mountain man's hands, which looked capable of crushing a man's skull, moved with startling, surgical gentleness. Caleb was watching with rapt attention, nodding, his posture stripped of its usual defensive armor. "He's a good teacher," a small voice piped up. Abigail looked down to see 9-year-old Sarah holding a wooden doll. Silas had carved for her from a block of soft cedar. Sarah, who hadn't spoken more than a whisper in half a year, was looking out the window with absolute adoration. "Yes, he is," Abigail murmured, a strange, tight knot forming in her chest. It terrified her. She was entirely dependent on a man whose history was written in the jagged scars across his face. She found herself watching the way his broad shoulders moved under his thick wool coat, the way his dark, quiet eyes tracked the horizon, always alert. She felt a deep, treacherous warmth spreading in her stomach whenever he looked at her, a feeling she rigorously tamped down. Survival didn't afford the luxury of romance, especially not with a man who belonged to the wild. The fragile peace shattered 2 days before Christmas. Silas had ridden into town to pay the back taxes, carrying a pouch of silver he'd earned from selling prime winter pelts. Abigail paced the cabin for hours, her stomach in knots. When Silas finally returned, it was well past dark. He didn't come to the cabin. He went straight to the barn. Abigail threw her shawl over her shoulders and marched out into the freezing night, pushing open the heavy barn door. Silas was unsaddling Goliath. In the dim light of the lantern, Abigail saw the blood on his knuckles. His jaw was locked tight, a muscle ticking violently beneath his heavy beard. "What happened?" she demanded, stepping into the warmth of the barn. "Did you pay the bank?" "Taxes are paid," Silas grunted, not looking at her. He pulled the heavy saddle off the horse and set it on a wooden sawhorse. "Receipts in my coat pocket." "Then whose blood is that, Silas?" He stopped, resting his large hands on the horse's broad back. He let out a long, ragged exhale. "Josiah Higgins." Abigail's blood ran cold. "You hit him?" "Silas, he owns half the town. He has the sheriff in his pocket." "He wasn't at the bank," Silas said, finally turning to face her. His eyes were dark, burning with a dangerous fire. "He was at the saloon. He was making a speech to his men, making a joke out of you, Abigail, telling them how he was going to wait for the deep freeze to starve you out, then take this land for pennies." Silas took a step toward her, the sheer size of him imposing, yet his voice remained tightly controlled. "He doesn't want this land for farming," I overheard him. "He's brokered a secret deal with the Omaha and Grant Smelting Company. They want to run a massive rail spur right through this valley to connect to the new copper mines up north. Your father's land is the only flat grade to the river. Higgins isn't a speculator. He's an agent for the railroad. If he gets this land, he becomes a millionaire." Abigail gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "A railroad? My father never knew." "Nobody knows. Higgins is trying to steal the valley blind before the company makes it public," Silas said. "I walked up to his table, put the tax receipt down, and told him the Preston farm was no longer his concern." "And the blood?" "Cole tried to draw his iron on me," Silas said flatly. "I broke his jaw. Higgins told me I was a dead man walking. I told him to make sure he sent men who knew how to shoot." Abigail felt the room spin. "You shouldn't have done that. You've just declared a war we can't win." "It's just you, Silas. There are 20 of them." "It ain't just me," Silas said, stepping closer. He reached out, his bloody, calloused hand hovering just inches from her cheek before he slowly lowered it. "I gave you my word, Abigail. I will help you raise those children. And no man, no railroad, and no amount of money is going to take this roof from over their heads." He looked at her with such fierce, unrelenting devotion that Abigail's breath caught in her throat. The walls she had built around her heart cracked, splintering under the weight of his promise. "They will come for us," she whispered, tears pooling in her eyes. "Let them," the mountain man replied. turning back to his horse. "The mountains taught me how to hunt. Higgins is about to learn he ain't the apex predator in this valley." The retaliation did
This
not
story
come
was
with
posted
the
on the
brazenness
channel
of a
The
daylight
Rusty
raid.
Saddle. Please do
Higgins
not
was a
repost
coward
it in
who
any
preferred
form.
the shadows. He waited until the dead of January, when the temperature dropped to 20 below zero and the snowdrifts swallowed the fence lines. It was a moonless, suffocatingly dark Tuesday night. Inside the cabin, Abigail was mending a pair of Caleb's trousers by the fading light of the hearth. Silas was sitting in the corner chair, meticulously cleaning his Henry rifle, a nightly ritual that brought a strange sense of comfort to the room. Toby was asleep in Sarah's arms in the big bed. Suddenly, Silas froze. The metallic click of the rifle parts stopped. He tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. "What is it?" Abigail asked, keeping her voice low. "The wind shifted," Silas murmured. He stood up in one fluid motion, moving to the window. He pressed his face near the glass. "I don't hear anything," Caleb said, looking up from his whittling. "Smell it," Silas commanded. Abigail paused, drawing in a breath. Beneath the familiar scent of their own pine fire, there was something sharp, acrid, and chemical. Kerosene. "The barn!" Silas roared, snatching his coat and rifle. "Caleb, stay here! Bar the door! Do not open it for anyone but me!" Silas threw open the cabin door and charged into the blinding snow. Abigail rushed to the window, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Through the swirling blizzard, a horrifying orange glow was rapidly blooming against the night sky. The barn, Silas's home, the shelter for their horses, and the remaining milk goats, was engulfed in flames. Outside, the cold was a physical blade, but Silas barely felt it. He sprinted toward the burning structure. He knew it was a trap. You don't burn a barn in a blizzard just to kill animals. You burn it to draw the men out of the cabin. As Silas approached the roaring inferno, a gunshot cracked through the howling wind. A bullet splintered the wooden trough just inches from his thigh. Silas dove behind a snow-covered woodpile, bringing his rifle up. Through the swirling snow and the chaotic, shifting light of the flames, he spotted 3 figures on horseback near the tree line. "Abigail, stay down!" Silas bellowed over the roar of the fire, hoping his voice carried to the cabin. He didn't fire blindly. Silas was a sniper at Gettysburg. Patience was carved into his bones. He waited for the flames to illuminate the lead rider. It was Cole, his jaw wired shut, holding a smoking repeater. Silas exhaled, settled his breathing, and squeezed the trigger. The heavy, .44 caliber slug tore through the winter air, striking Cole's horse in the shoulder. The animal screamed and bucked wildly, throwing Cole into the deep snow. The other 2 riders panicked, firing wildly into the dark, before turning their horses and fleeing into the timber. Abandoning their fallen comrade, Silas didn't pursue them. The barn roof was groaning, the flames licking at the night sky. The terrified screams of Goliath and the mules echoed from inside. Dropping his rifle, Silas charged straight into the burning building. The heat was immense, searing his eyelashes and singing his beard. Smoke blinded him. He kicked open the stall doors, slapping the rumps of the panicked mules, driving them out into the snow. He found Goliath rearing, kicking at the burning walls. "Easy! Giant! Easy!" Silas roared, throwing his heavy wool coat over the horse's head to blind him to the flames. He grabbed the halter and hauled the massive animal out of the barn just as the main loft beam, weakened by the fire, gave way with a deafening crack. A shower of burning embers and heavy, flaming timber crashed down. A jagged piece of burning wood struck Silas squarely across the back of his right shoulder, driving him into the snow. The pain was blinding, a sickening sizzle of burning wool and flesh. Silas, through the haze of pain, he saw Abigail running through the knee-deep snow, oblivious to the danger, a bucket of well water in her hands. She threw the freezing water over his smoldering shoulder, falling to her knees beside him. "I'm all right," he rasped, though his face was gray, his teeth gritted in agony. He looked up at the barn. It was a total loss. Caleb came running out next, eyes wide with horror as he looked at the blazing ruins. The goats. I didn't get the goats. The boy sobbed, the tough exterior shattering. Silas reached out with his good arm, grabbing the boy by his suspenders. We are alive, son. The horses are alive. The cabin stands. We don't weep for what's lost. We fight for what's left. It took them an hour to wrangle the terrified animals and tie them to the leeward side of the cabin to block the wind. Inside, the reality of the situation set in. Silas sat shirtless on a wooden stool near the fire. The right side of his back was a horrific canvas of blistered, raw flesh where the burning beam had struck him. Abigail's hands trembled violently as she boiled water and tore clean linen strips from her own petticoat. She mixed a salve of honey and the last of their yarrow. This is going to hurt, she whispered, her voice choked with tears. I've had worse, Silas lied quietly. As she gently applied the salve, Silas couldn't suppress a harsh groan, his massive muscles locking in pain. Abigail leaned forward, her forehead instinctively resting against his uninjured left shoulder as she worked, her tears hot against his skin. They tried to kill you, she sobbed, the terror finally breaking her iron composure. Because of us. Because of me. You should leave, Silas. In the morning, you take Goliath and you ride up the mountain. Higgins won't stop until you're dead. Silas turned his head slightly, looking down at the beautiful, exhausted woman weeping against his shoulder. He reached up with his left hand, his rough thumb gently wiping a tear from her soot-stained cheek. Abigail, he said, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that vibrated through her. I spent 10 years surviving, but I wasn't living. Not until I walked into this cabin. He gently lifted her chin, forcing her to look into his dark, unwavering eyes. I ain't running from Josiah Higgins, and I ain't leaving you. Not tomorrow. Not ever. Abigail stared at him, her heart completely stripped of its defenses. In the flickering light of the hearth, amidst the smell of smoke and burned flesh, she realized the terrifying truth. The bargain they had struck in the snow was gone. She didn't just need his protection anymore. She leaned in, and for the first time, pressed her lips to his. It was a desperate, fierce kiss, tasting of wood smoke, tears, and an unyielding promise. Silas groaned, his good arm pulling her tightly against his chest, holding her as if she were the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. Outside, the wind howled, burying the ashes of the barn in fresh snow. The war with Higgins had escalated to blood and fire, but within the walls of the tiny cabin, a bond forged in iron and survival had finally ignited into something entirely unbreakable. The morning after the fire, the Bitter Creek Valley was eerily silent, the storm having blown itself out, leaving behind a sky the color of bruised iron. The charred, smoking skeleton of the barn stood as a blackened monument to Josiah Higgins's cruelty. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere had irrevocably shifted. The kiss they had shared in the desperate, smoky dark had crossed a boundary that could not be uncrossed. As Abigail changed the dressing on Silas's blistered back, her hands were no longer just the hands of a grateful caretaker. They lingered with a fierce, possessive tenderness. Silas, for his part, looked at her not as a fragile thing to be protected, but as his equal, a woman forged in the same relentless fires of survival that had shaped him. But the mountain man knew better than to trust the quiet. Higgins failed to burn us out, Silas rasped, his voice tight as he pulled a fresh linen shirt over his heavily bandaged shoulder. Which means he won't try fire again. He's going to use paper. Silas's prediction was frighteningly accurate, but neither of them could have anticipated the sheer, calculating malice of Josiah Higgins's next move. 2 weeks passed. February brought a false thaw that turned the valley roads into a treacherous soup of freezing mud. Silas was healing, his immense constitution fighting off the infection that Abigail had feared. Caleb had stepped up, taking over the heavy chopping and the trap lines, fiercely protective of the man who had become the father he so desperately needed. On a gray Tuesday afternoon, a heavy wagon rumbled up the muddy drive, escorted by 4 riders. Abigail stepped onto
This
the
story was
porch,
posted
her
on the
heart
channel The
seizing.
Rusty Saddle.
It wasn't
Please do
just
not
Higgins
repost
and his
it in any
hired
form.
thugs this time. Leading the group was a man wearing a long canvas duster and a silver star pinned to his lapel. Silas stepped out behind her, his Henry rifle resting casually but deliberately in the crook of his good arm. He immediately recognized the man with the badge. It was Deputy U.S. Marshal Thomas Harrison, a man known throughout the Wyoming Territory for being ruthlessly efficient and historically compliant with the wealthy cattle barons and land speculators of Cheyenne. "Put the rifle down, Montgomery," Harrison called out, his hand resting on the pearl grip of his Colt revolver. "I'm here on official business under the authority of Judge Alistair Borman of the 1st District." "State your business, Harrison," Silas replied, his voice a low, warning rumble that made the deputy's horse dance nervously. Josiah Higgins rode forward, a smug, venomous smile twisting his features. He looked at the burned remains of the barn and chuckled. "Looks like you had a bit of an accident, Abigail. Such a shame. A farm without a barn is hardly a farm at all." "What do you want, Josiah?" Abigail demanded, her voice ringing out sharp and clear. She refused to show them an ounce of fear. Marshal Harrison pulled a folded piece of heavy parchment from his coat. "Silas Montgomery, I have a warrant for your arrest. You are charged with the attempted murder of one Calvin Cole Miller, who was shot in the back on this property 2 weeks ago. You're also charged with grand larceny, specifically the theft of a draft horse belonging to the Higgins Land Company." Abigail gasped. "That is a lie. Cole and 2 other men came here in the middle of a blizzard and set our barn on fire. Silas was defending this family. And that horse, Goliath, belongs to Silas." "Cole Miller tells a different story, Miss Preston," Harrison drawled lazily. "He says he was riding past, saw the fire, and came to help. Says your wild mountain man shot him without provocation. As for the horse, Mr. Higgins holds a bill of sale, proving the animal was stolen from his livery last spring." Higgins tapped the side of his head, feigning sympathy. "The man is a feral hermit, Abigail. He's clearly unhinged. You let a violent criminal around these poor orphaned children. The county judge is very concerned about their welfare. The trap was utterly brilliant. Higgins wasn't just taking Silas out of the picture. He was laying the legal groundwork to have Abigail declared an unfit guardian so the state would take the children and, consequently, the land." Suddenly, the front door banged open. Caleb stood on the threshold, his father's old, double-barreled shotgun leveled directly at Higgins's chest. The 14-year-old was shaking, his face pale with rage. "You ain't taking him. He didn't do nothing wrong. You get off our land before I blow you to kingdom come." Every man in the posse drew their weapons. 4 guns clicked back, aimed squarely at the boy. "Caleb, no!" Abigail screamed, throwing herself in front of her brother. "Hold your fire," Silas roared, the sound echoing off the valley walls like thunder. He moved with blinding speed despite his injury, stepping in front of Abigail and Caleb, his massive frame shielding them completely. He looked back at the boy. "Put it down, son." "Silas, they'll hang you," Caleb cried, tears of pure frustration spilling down his cheeks. "A man who fights the law in the mud loses his soul, Caleb," Silas said softly, his dark eyes intensely locked on the boy's. "You are the man of this house right now. You put that gun down and you look after your sisters. That is an order." Caleb stared at him for a long, agonizing moment before slowly lowering the barrel. Silas turned back to the marshal. He carefully uncocked his Henry rifle and set it on the porch. He walked down the steps, raising his hands, his face a mask of absolute stone, as Harrison's deputies roughly bound Silas's wrists with heavy iron cuffs. Higgins spurred his horse closer to Abigail. "I'll be back on Friday with the bank manager, Abigail. The property will be foreclosed, and the children will be sent to the parish orphanage in Laramie. Have your bags packed." Abigail watched them drag Silas into the back of the wagon. He didn't fight. He just looked at her, a silent, unwavering promise in his eyes, before the wagon lurched forward, taking away the man she loved and the last pillar of their survival. She stood in the freezing mud long after the posse disappeared over the ridge. Caleb was sobbing quietly on the porch. Sarah and Toby were huddled in the doorway, terrified. Abigail Preston closed her eyes. She felt the exhaustion, the grief, and the bitter cold threatening to pull her under. But as she opened her eyes and looked at the charred ruins of the barn, she didn't feel broken. She felt a blinding, terrifying, white-hot rage. Josiah Higgins thought he had outsmarted a stupid mountain man and a helpless little girl. He was about to learn that he had just backed a desperate mother into a corner. Abigail stood in the freezing mud long after the wagon, carrying Silas, disappeared over the snow-capped ridge. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by Caleb's jagged breaths. The 14-year-old was staring at the wagon tracks in the mud, his face a mask of helpless fury. But Abigail did not weep. The tears that had so easily fallen months ago were gone, burned away by the sheer, unadulterated rage coursing through her veins. Josiah Higgins thought he had outsmarted a feral mountain man and broken a helpless young woman. He was about to learn that backing a desperate mother into a corner was the most dangerous mistake a man could make. She marched back into the cabin, pulled her father's heavy, wool-lined coat from its peg, and turned to her brother. "Lock the door, Caleb. Keep Pa's shotgun loaded. Do not open it for anyone but me or Silas," she ordered, her voice ringing with a terrifying, absolute authority that made the boy stand up straight. "Where are you going?" Caleb asked, his hands trembling as he gripped the heavy wooden stock of the weapon. "To start a fire of my own," Abigail replied. She saddled their remaining mule, ignoring the biting wind that whipped her hair across her face, and rode the 5 miles into Bitter Creek at a breakneck pace. The town was a miserable collection of false front buildings, shivering under the gray February sky. She didn't go to the sheriff. She knew his badge was bought and paid for with Higgins's blood money. Instead, she tied her mule outside the telegraph office, a small shack run by Arthur Sullivan, a one-armed Union veteran who harbored a deep, quiet hatred for the town's wealthy tyrant. The brass bell jingled sharply as Abigail kicked the door open. Sullivan looked up from his desk, his eyes widening. "Abigail? Good Lord. Girl, you look like a ghost. I heard about Silas. The whole town is talking." "Mr. Sullivan, I need you to send a wire," Abigail interrupted, slamming her last 2 silver dollars onto the wooden counter. "I need you to send it directly to the executive offices of the Omaha and Grant Smelting Company in Chicago." Sullivan blinked, his bushy eyebrows knitting together. "The smelting company? Why in God's name would you be wiring them?" "Because Josiah Higgins is an agent for them, secretly securing land for a new railroad spur," Abigail said, leaning over the counter, her voice dropping to a fierce, urgent whisper. "He's been buying up foreclosed farms for pennies, telling the bank they are worthless. But he's not transferring the deeds to the company. He's putting them in his own private trust. When the railroad finally makes its plans public, he's going to sell the land back to his own employers at a massive premium. He is stealing from his own company, Mr. Sullivan." The veteran's jaw dropped. The audacity of the scheme was staggering. "Are you certain, Abigail? If you're wrong, Higgins will sue you for slander and take the very clothes off your back. He'll ruin you." Silas heard him bragging about it to his hired guns. "I am betting my life on it. Please." Sullivan looked at the desperate, fierce young woman. Then at the 2 silver dollars, he pushed the coins back across the counter. "Keep your money, Miss Preston. I've been waiting for 5 years for someone to finally gut that snake." For the next 10 minutes, the telegraph key clacked furiously, sending a detailed message to the corporate barons in Chicago, exposing Higgins's double dealing and demanding an immediate audit of the Bitter Creek land acquisitions. But Abigail wasn't finished. She left the office and marched straight into the crowded local mercantile. Mrs. Agatha Gable and half the town's women were huddled near the stove, actively gossiping about Silas's arrest. Abigail stepped up onto a heavy wooden crate of feed, drawing every shocked eye in the room. "Josiah Higgins isn't buying your farms to help you," she shouted, her voice ringing off the rafters and silencing the whispers. "He's stealing them. The railroad is coming through this valley, and our land is about to be worth 10 times what we owe. He burned my barn and arrested an innocent man to silence him. And he will do the same to every single one of you when he wants your water rights." The room erupted. The seeds of doubt had been planted, and the fire of rebellion caught instantly. Friday arrived with a suffocating, terrifying tension. The sky was the color of slate, spitting
This story
a
was
freezing
posted
mix
on the
of
channel
rain
The
and
Rusty
snow.
Saddle.
Abigail
Please do not
stood on her
repost it
porch,
in any
her
form.
father's shotgun resting heavily over her forearm. Caleb stood beside her, gripping Silas's spare Winchester. At noon, Josiah Higgins rode up. But he was not accompanied by the bank manager or the marshal. He was flanked by Cole, his jaw heavily bandaged, and 4 heavily armed thugs. Higgins's face was purple with unhinged rage. He had intercepted a telegram meant for Sullivan that morning. The Chicago executives were sending a team of Pinkerton investigators to audit his ledgers. He was utterly ruined, unless he could silence the source. "You stupid, arrogant little girl," Higgins spat, dismounting his horse and drawing his Colt revolver. "You think a telegram is going to save you? I'm the law in this valley. I'll kill you and the boy right here and tell the sheriff you resisted eviction." "You've lost, Josiah," Abigail said, her hands shaking, but her voice steady. "The town knows. The company knows. If you shoot us, you'll hang. I'll take my chances." Higgins snarled, raising his gun. "Cole, kill the boy!" Crack! A shot echoed from the ridge, a deafening roar that shattered the tense silence. The gun in Higgins's hand exploded into a shower of twisted metal and splintered wood, violently torn from his grip. Higgins screamed, clutching his mangled, bleeding hand. Everyone froze, looking up toward the tree line. Emerging from the dense pines, looking like an avenging spirit of the mountains, was Silas Montgomery. He was riding Goliath, his face battered and bruised from his time in the jailhouse, but his eyes were burning with a terrifying, ancient fury. In his hands, he held a massive, long-barreled Sharps buffalo rifle. "I told you," Silas roared, his voice echoing off the valley walls like thunder. "Make sure you send men who know how to shoot." Suddenly, the sound of multiple horses approaching drew their attention back to the road. It wasn't more thugs. It was Arthur Sullivan, leading a posse of 20 local farmers and ranchers, all armed with hunting rifles and shotguns. "Drop the iron, Cole," Sullivan shouted. "The sheriff is locked in his own cell. We know everything, Higgins." Higgins fell to his knees in the mud, realizing his empire had just collapsed. Silas rode his massive horse down into the yard, keeping the heavy rifle trained on the ruined man. "You're done here, Josiah. You ride out of this valley today, or you don't ride out at all." The thugs dropped their guns. As the townsfolk moved in to apprehend the corrupt businessman, Silas dismounted and walked straight toward the porch. Abigail dropped the shotgun and flew off the steps, throwing her arms around his massive neck. Silas caught her, burying his face in her hair. "How did you get out?" she sobbed. "Sullivan," Silas murmured. "Walked into the jail with a telegram, told the deputy Higgins was wanted by the feds, and suggested he unlock my cell if he didn't want to hang as an accomplice." He pulled back, reaching into his pocket to pull out a small, crudely forged iron ring made from a horseshoe nail. "I told you I wanted to help raise them," Silas said, his dark eyes vulnerable. "But I want to build a life with you, if you'll have a scarred-up mountain man." Abigail looked at the ring, then at the man who had saved them. "I wouldn't want anyone else." The Bitter Creek Valley eventually echoed with the sharp, metallic shrieks of the railroad, but the iron tracks never crossed the Preston property. With Higgins imprisoned for corporate fraud, the land remained safe. its value soaring to provide a comfortable life. Silas and Abigail married in a quiet ceremony beside the rebuilt barn, their union forging a family that was legendary for its fierce loyalty. Caleb grew into a formidable rancher, guided by the quiet wisdom of his adoptive father. Sarah and Toby thrived, their childhoods filled with the scent of pine and the deep rumbling laughter of the giant who loved them. The wild mountain man never returned to his solitary cave. He had finally found a warmth stronger than any hearth fire. Together, Silas and Abigail proved that even in the harshest winter of the human spirit, an unbroken love can weather any storm.